Welcome back to 1% Weekly. In this week's episode, I want to talk about how you can win a Nobel Prize even if you're an economist. I want to talk about the case of the mysterious disappearing £490 billion from the UK's wealth, and I want to share some of the not so good stuff that came out of Philip Hammond's recent budget. If you saw my recent mini-series based on Tony Robbins' latest book, Unshakable, we looked at the common mistakes that investors make, and often it's about the way they think. Well, what's sometimes called behavioural economics has finally been recognised and given a Nobel Prize, or at least the prize has gone to Richard Thaler, who's a kind of latter-day advocate of this kind of thing. But there's nothing new under the sun about this. What's happened is that in the days of Adam Smith, he was very interested in human psychology. Then somehow it all got kind of made into a science, as if somehow we make all our decisions perfectly rationally and logically, and we're not emotional creatures at all. Well, I don't know about you, but that certainly wouldn't apply to any of the decisions made in my household. The reality, as we all know, is we make emotional decisions and then we desperately try to find reasons to rationalize them with facts and figures later. So, what's being recognized now is the human element of economics. And if we can return economics to having this behavioral aspect, I think it'll become a more relevant science than it's been these last few decades. Even earlier, if you go back to the 1970s, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky put their thinking into a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, and it talks about two kinds of thinking, System 1 and System 2. And System 1 decision making is a kind of gut, instinctive sort of thing where you rely on kind of rules of thumb and what sometimes get called heuristics. System 2 is more logical, slower thinking, more analytical, break it all down a bit, have a proper look at it. And when it comes to the world of investing, clearly we need to use more System 2 thinking and less of the System 1 stuff. Now, that all sounds a bit technical when you talk about those kind of things, but the way I like to see it is that you should kind of automate and systematize your investing decisions as far as possible. So if you think back to the wealth pyramid, you've got low risk, low return stuff, medium risk, medium return, high risk, high return. Just have some criteria for what constitutes each of those three levels, and then know what you're going to do with each proportion of your savings. So if you're saving 20% of your income, let's say, maybe 10% goes into the first level of your pyramid, 5 into the second, and 5 into the third. And then you just set up standing orders, you know exactly where it's going, and it's not a decision, it's a process. And that's what wealth's all about. It's a slow accumulation of wealth by setting repeatable habits and taking the emotion out of it. So let's recognize that behavioral economics really does exist, but let's try and conquer it by just getting systematized and automated with our planning so that wealth just happens naturally rather than emotionally. I've long been skeptical about government numbers, especially on things like inflation. But the latest report from the Office for National Statistics is truly staggering. They have found that we are £490 billion poorer as a nation than we thought we were. Now, we all lose a few coins down the back of the sofa. We might even have a tenner fly out of our hand on a windy day, but £490 billion wiped off UK PLC? What on earth is going on? Apparently, we thought that Brits held more shares abroad than they actually do. Turns out we don't, and it turns out that foreigners own more assets in this country than we thought we had. So the net of all that is that our international investment position has gone from a surplus of 469 billion to a net deficit of 22 billion. It's no better when you look at foreign direct investment. That's gone from a surplus of 120 billion in the first half of 2016 to a 25 billion deficit in the same period this year. The Bank of New York Mellon says that there's been a marked deterioration over recent weeks in the money that's chasing sterling assets, from pension funds, sovereign wealth funds and things like that. So they are seeing a decline. It's really, they summarize it as saying the big buyers are disappearing. And what's particularly worrying is that we've got a 4.6% deficit on our current account. Now, imagine that's a bit like your monthly budget at home. Imagine that, if you've got, I don't know, 5,000 a month coming in, and suddenly you've got, a 5% shortfall every single month. What you're going to do, you're going to be increasing the borrowing on a credit card. You're going to be going to your mates to borrow a bit of cash to get you through. Maybe take a payday loan at 1,900% APR to get you through at the end of the month. That's what's happening to us as a nation. And we're only being propped up at the moment because the ECB, the European Central Bank, is doing a whole load of bond buying in Europe, and some of those transactions spill over into Britain because they want to get the best possible yields, so they start buying up British treasuries as well. So that is going to halve in the next few months and then disappear completely in 2018 when Mario Draghi stops the ECB bond buying process. So the question is, as the ECB winds down its bond buying, it's going to be cut in half by the end of this year and disappear completely in 2018. How are we going to plug this almost 5% current account deficit gap? In a time when people are buying anything, you can buy 100-year Argentine government bonds at the moment if you're crazy enough. You think, oh, well, there won't be a problem. But it wouldn't take much to just knock this over, this little house of cards here. It could be a fall in the value of the pound. It could be the impact of the disappearing bonds. One of these things could trigger a financial crisis during 2018. So we need to keep a very close eye on the overall health of UK PLC. The Bible says, "The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away." The same applies to Spreadsheet Phil. Last week we talked about the gifts he's given us in this year's budget. Today I've got to tell you about some of the things he's either taking away or hiking up to make it worse for you and I. I think the most cynical one is what he's doing with capital gains tax for companies. What you may know is that capital gains tax for individuals doesn't allow for any kind of inflation indexing. What he's now done is he's withdrawn that benefit for capital gains in companies. So the indexation relief will be ended from the 1st of January 2018. So what this means is that you will now pay capital gains tax even if an asset's value has only gone up in line with inflation. Of course, he can now say this is to promote fairness because companies are being treated the same as individuals. Obviously, it's just another way of raising some tax to try and fill his rather thin coffers at the moment. Thanks for that one, Phil. Next applies to company cars. This one, I guess, was fairly predictable to see coming. If you are one of those criminals who bought a diesel car, then you're going to have to pay higher tax on that as a company vehicle. So the car benefit charge is going to be increased from 3% to 4% on diesel vehicles. What amuses me is at the same time he made some apparent giveaways on electric vehicles, and this really does amuse me. Yes, of course the diesel car is dirty at the point of use. The electric car is clean at the point of use. Does anyone stop to think where the electricity comes from that you're putting into that electric car? It actually might be some coal-fired power station up the road belching smoke out into the atmosphere, but it doesn't happen in front of your very eyes, therefore it doesn't count. So for me, somewhat skeptical and cynical about all this, but there you are. Any diesel company cars, I think, are going to start disappearing from company fleets over the next 2 or 3 years, presumably to be replaced with electric cars rather than petrol ones. So look out for that. The third thing that Hammond has changed in this budget concerns companies that are using EIS, SEIS and VCT, venture capital trusts. What he's saying is that they're going to deny relief where the investment is made purely for tax purposes and the capital is not really put at risk. Now it sounds like he's having a go at some of the asset-backed investments where potentially you're getting a good return from the tax benefits without really risking losing your capital because there's an asset sitting underneath it somewhere. The problem is, how do you tell what is and what isn't going to qualify with this? Because it's a reasonable view test. And HMRC has said that they won't offer an opinion on whether something does or does not qualify. You're going to have to self-certify that it does, and of course they could prove you're wrong later, and you have to pay back all the relief that you've had. So you could ask a few film investors about that. There's a few of those things that have turned a bit pear-shaped. So you are really going to be in the driving seat for this. You're going to have to see whether it is essentially an asset-backed opportunity where you don't put your capital at risk, or whether there's a significant risk to capital that justifies what the government regard as these effective tax breaks. So it's uncertainty, it's self-certification, and no clarity from the HMRC as to what does and doesn't qualify. Happy days once again. So that's it for another episode of 1% Weekly. I hope you found the information useful. Obviously, we can only go into a little bit of detail in these kind of short programs. What I would really encourage you to do is get the full facts on some of these recent changes. Make sure you and your accountant, and if necessary your tax advisor, are in the room thrashing out how you're going to deal with this stuff. Because when you're in the 1%, these kind of things are sent to try us. We have to be on top of them. And I'll tell you some more information about some new challenges in the episode next week. Thanks for watching.